The wind howled through the empty stretch of ocean, a hollow cry that echoed across the vast and endless expanse. Beneath the black sky, the waves churned, slapping against the sides of a ship that seemed more a shadow than a vessel. Its sails, tattered and worn, billowed in the gusts as it cut through the water with an eerie, almost unnatural grace. The ship had been forgotten by time itself, drifting in the void of space and memory. Yet those who had ventured too close had learned that the black ship was not a mere relic of the past, but something far darker, far more sinister. The stories about the black ship were whispered in hushed tones, passed down by sailors who dared not speak too loudly for fear the ship might hear. It was said to be a vessel of doom, cursed by the very forces of nature itself. Those who boarded it never returned, their fates sealed by the ship's haunting, otherworldly presence. But there was one thing that none could agree on: what lay beneath its decks. As the ship sailed through the void, no one could truly explain the magnetic pull that it seemed to have on certain individuals. It called to them, its unseen force dragging them toward its dark hull, as if some ancient, forgotten god of the sea had decided that their fate was to be entangled with its own. Some thought it a treasure ship, lost to time with a hold filled with unimaginable riches. Others believed it was a prison, a place where the damned were sent to atone for sins long past. But no one knew for certain. And it was that uncertainty that kept the rumors alive, feeding the fear and the curiosity that so many felt when they gazed upon the black ship from a distance. Among those who had heard the whispers was a small crew, led by a captain whose name had long been forgotten by most. He was a man of few words, his face carved by years of hardship and uncertainty. His crew, equally silent, moved like shadows across the deck, knowing their mission was one they could not turn back from. They had seen the black ship on the horizon, just as so many others had, and they had made a pact to discover the truth of what lay beneath its rotting hull. As they drew closer, the air grew thick with tension. The crew could feel it, the unmistakable sense of something watching them, waiting. The waters around the ship turned black, as if the very ocean itself had taken on the color of the abyss. The wind shifted, becoming colder, sharper, as if the ship itself was breathing in the night air, preparing to reveal its secrets. On board, the crew moved cautiously, eyes darting between the masts and the endless black sky. There was no sound except the creaking of the ship, the groan of its bones under the weight of centuries. Every now and then, the faintest glow flickered beneath the water, like a distant light calling them forward, urging them deeper into the unknown. The first mate, a man whose nerves were as tight as the ropes that held the sails aloft, paced the deck. His thoughts were consumed by the stories he had heard in the taverns, those drunken tales spun by men who had seen the ship from afar. None of them had returned to tell what had truly happened. He clutched his sword, feeling its weight as though it was the only thing tethering him to reality. "Keep your wits about you," he muttered under his breath. "There's nothing normal about this place. Nothing good." As the ship neared its dark counterpart, the water around it seemed to become colder, unnaturally so. The crew shivered, though they tried to mask their fear with bravado. But no matter how many layers they wore, no matter how much they told themselves they were prepared for what lay ahead, the sense of unease only grew. "Ready the grappling hooks," the captain called, his voice steady despite the tension that was thick in the air. He was a man who had seen too much, yet still carried the weight of hope. They would board the black ship, they would learn its secrets, and they would return at least. That was the plan. But with each passing moment, the certainty of their return seemed less and less likely. As the first mate prepared to throw the hook, something caught his eye, a flicker in the distance, deep beneath the water. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, a trick of his own tired mind. But then it moved again, closer this time, like something large shifting beneath the surface. The others didn't seem to notice, their focus consumed by the task at hand. But the first mate couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something was waiting. The ship came alongside the black ship with the eerie quiet of a predator closing in on its prey. The crew readied themselves, tightening their grips on their weapons. The black ship loomed before them like a great, ancient creature, its massive hull covered in seaweed and barnacles that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Its windows were dark, empty, as though it had not been inhabited in centuries. And yet, as they drew closer, there was something that felt wrong about it. The first mate was the first to step onto the black ship, his boots making no sound as they touched the rotting wood. The rest followed, their faces grim, their eyes scanning every inch of the shadowy deck. The air smelled of salt and decay, a fetid mix that clung to the back of their throats. It was like stepping into the belly of a long-dead beast, its organs liquefied by the passing of time. Every footstep seemed to echo in the silence, but no answers came. The ship gave no sign of life. It was as though it had been abandoned long ago, left to rot and sink into oblivion. And yet, they felt the sense that they were not alone, that something watched them, waited for them to uncover the truth. They moved deeper into the heart of the ship, the creaking of its old timbers, the only sound breaking the stillness. The captain's hand brushed the wall of the corridor as he passed, the wood feeling soft and unnaturally warm, as though it was still alive. It made his skin crawl, but he pressed on. Then they reached the door. The heavy wooden door at the end of the hall was partially ajar, a crack of darkness spilling out from behind it. The captain motioned for the crew to stop. He placed a hand on the door, the surface strangely cool despite the warmth of the ship. For a moment, he hesitated, feeling the weight of his decision. This was it. They had come this far, and now they would face whatever lay beyond. The door creaked open, and as it did, the crew was hit by a rush of cold air. Something was waiting on the other side. They stepped inside, but the sight before them was unlike anything they could have imagined. The door groaned open, and a gust of cold air rushed out, smelling of something old and rancid. The crew hesitated for a moment, glancing at one another in nervous silence. Every instinct screamed at them to turn back, to abandon this mission before it was too late. But there was no retreat now, not after everything they had already gone through to get here. The black ship had claimed them, one way or another, and they had no choice but to step into its dark, suffocating heart. The captain was the first to move. His feet shifted cautiously across the threshold, his every step echoing in the empty space. As he passed through the door, he felt an unsettling chill that seemed to seep into his very bones. His breath was visible in the air, despite the warmth of the sea outside. The others followed him, their faces tight with determination, but their eyes filled with unease. The room beyond the door was massive, stretching far beyond what any of them had expected. The walls were adorned with strange, unrecognizable symbols, swirling patterns that seemed to move when no one was looking directly at them. The dim light, coming from an unknown source, cast long dancing shadows across the floor, creating an illusion of movement even in the stillness. The space felt endless, as though the ship itself were much larger on the inside than it should have been. In the center of the room stood a large stone pedestal, dark and cracked, its surface covered in centuries of dust. Atop it was something that glimmered in the eerie light. The captain stepped closer, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached out a hand, but before he could touch it, a voice rang out, low and hollow. "Do not disturb it." The crew froze, their eyes darting around the room in search of the source of the voice. It wasn't the voice of any of them. It was deeper, colder, like the very essence of the sea itself speaking. The words seemed to vibrate in the air, as though they were coming from all directions at once. The captain's grip tightened around the hilt of his sword, his knuckles white. "Who's there?" he called, his voice steady despite the fear that crept up his spine. For a long moment, there was silence. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch, as if something large and hidden within them was shifting. And then slowly, figures began to emerge from the darkness. They were not human, at least not anymore. They were creatures of the ship, or perhaps something more. Tall and skeletal, their skin an unnatural shade of grey, their faces twisted in expressions of agony and despair. They moved slowly, almost methodically, their eyes fixed on the crew, as though they had been waiting for them. The captain's hand hovered over his weapon, but there was no need to draw it. These creatures made no move to attack. Instead, they simply circled around the pedestal, their hollow eyes never leaving the crew. A chill ran through the captain as one of them stepped forward. The creature's gaze was piercing, almost knowing. It looked at him for what felt like an eternity, its presence overwhelming. Finally, it spoke, its voice rasping like dry leaves scraping across stone. "You seek the truth," it said, its words like a cold wind that cut straight to the bone. "But the truth is not a gift. It is a curse." The first mate, who'd been standing near the door, stepped forward, his voice trembling with a mix of curiosity and fear. "What? What do you mean? What is this place?" The creature turned its head, its movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. "This ship, it does not belong to the living. It is a prison, a place where the souls of the lost are bound for eternity. Those who seek it are drawn by the very darkness that holds it together. And those who enter never leave unchanged." The air grew heavier as the creature's words sank in. The captain could feel a sense of dread creeping up his spine, a warning that their mission had already gone far beyond what they had ever imagined. The black ship was not just a ship. It was a vessel for something much older, much darker. And the truth they sought would come at a price they had not yet begun to understand. Suddenly, there was a loud crack, followed by the sound of something shifting deep within the ship. The captain's head snapped toward the source of the noise. The floor beneath their feet seemed to tremble, as though the ship itself was alive. Waking from a long slumber, a low rumble echoed through the room, and the shadows on the walls twisted and stretched, as if they were no longer content to remain confined. "What's happening?" the first mate asked, his voice rising in panic. The captain didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the pedestal, where the glimmering object atop it had started to pulse, its light growing brighter and more erratic. It was as though the ship was reacting to their presence, as though the very heart of it was waking to confront them. The shadows began to move faster, the whispers growing louder, swirling in the air like a tempest. "Get away from it," the captain ordered, but it was too late. A sharp, piercing noise filled the air, like metal scraping against metal, and the pedestal split in two, revealing a dark void beneath it. From the depths of that black hole, a cold, unnatural light began to pour out, spilling across the floor like ink in water. The crew recoiled, but the darkness seemed to reach for them, pulling them closer. Without warning, the creature closest to the captain lunged, its skeletal hand grabbing him by the arm with an unnatural strength. The captain cried out, struggling to break free, but the creature's grip was like iron, cold and unyielding. Its eyes bore into him, empty yet full of something far more terrifying. "You do not understand," it whispered, its breath like the echo of 1,000 lost souls. "What you seek will destroy you." The captain fought back, but the creature's hold only tightened. The air around them was thick with the pressure of something ancient and forgotten, something that had slumbered beneath the ocean for far too long, and now it was awake. And it was angry. The crew scrambled to pull the captain free, but they were no match for the strength of the creature. They struck it, but it barely reacted, its hollow eyes fixated on the captain, as though it were trying to drag him into the abyss with it. The shadows around them grew deeper, the light from the pedestal now casting strange shapes on the walls. Figures seemed to move within the darkness, indistinct but undeniably present. The captain's breath was shallow, panic rising in his chest. He could feel the pull of the darkness, like 1,000 invisible hands reaching for him, trying to drag him down. "We have to leave," he shouted, but his words were lost in the cacophony of whispers that now filled the room. They were no longer just whispers, they were voices, hundreds, thousands, all calling to him, all begging for release. And then, as quickly as it had begun, the ship fell silent. The creature released the captain, its grip loosening as if it had suddenly lost interest in him. It stepped back into the shadows, its hollow gaze never leaving him. The pedestal's light began to flicker, dimming until the room was once again bathed in darkness. The crew stood there breathless, their hearts racing. The tension in the air was palpable, suffocating. No one spoke. No one dared to move. And then, from the shadows, another voice emerged, this one different, sharper, more menacing. "You should not have come." The voice that emerged from the shadows was cold and commanding, unlike anything they had heard before. It was a voice that seemed to reverberate in the very walls of the black ship, a voice that carried with it the weight of centuries. The air grew even heavier, thick with a sense of foreboding that made it impossible to breathe. The crew could feel it, a pressure that squeezed their chests, as if the ship itself was drawing them in closer. The captain's heart pounded in his chest as he stepped back, his eyes scanning the darkened room for the source of the voice. He had faced many dangers in his time, but nothing like this. There was something deeply unsettling about this place, something ancient, something wrong. And now, with that voice echoing in the chamber, he knew that they had made a grave mistake. "We did not come to desecrate," the captain said, his voice hoarse, though he struggled to maintain control. "We came to understand, to seek the truth." A low, mocking laugh echoed from the shadows, sending a shiver down his spine. "Understand? The truth you seek is beyond your comprehension, mortal. It is not something you can control, nor something you can survive." The room seemed to tremble as the voice grew louder, surrounding them, filling every corner. And then, just as quickly, the ship fell silent once more, the stillness almost deafening. The first mate, who had been watching the shadows carefully, suddenly stiffened. His eyes widened in realization, and he turned to the captain, his voice shaking with fear. "The truth. It's not a thing, Captain. It's a force. The ship. It's not just alive, it feeds." The captain's gaze snapped to the first mate, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What are you talking about?" "It's the ship," the first mate said, his voice growing frantic. "This place. It's a prison for something far older than us. The souls of the damned aren't just trapped here, they're kept here to sustain something. Something much worse. We didn't come looking for treasure, Captain. We came to feed it." The words hung in the air like a terrible omen, and the captain's blood ran cold. He realized, in that instant, the truth that had eluded him all this time. The black ship wasn't just a ghost ship. It was a vessel built to imprison something ancient, something that had been consuming the souls of the lost for as long as it had existed. A harsh, guttural growl pierced the silence, and the shadows suddenly shifted, coiling and writhing as if alive. The room began to darken even further, and the crew could feel the temperature drop to a freezing point. They were standing at the threshold of something far worse than they had imagined, a darkness that could not be undone. The ship was alive, and it was hungry. The captain felt a cold hand on his shoulder, spinning him around. He came face to face with one of the creatures, its eyes hollow and filled with an emptiness that seemed to stretch into eternity. The captain's breath caught in his throat as the creature whispered, its voice like the crackling of dead leaves. "It's too late. There is no escape. The ship has claimed you." A cry rang out behind them, and the crew spun around to see one of their own fall to the floor, his body convulsing as if it were being dragged toward the center of the room. The shadows moved like quicksand, swallowing him whole. His screams were cut short as the darkness consumed him completely, leaving nothing but an empty space in his place. "Run!" the captain shouted, his voice raw with desperation. But the words felt hollow. The shadows were everywhere now, creeping along the walls, rising from the floor, filling the air with a suffocating presence. The black ship had come alive, and it was claiming them one by one. The crew rushed toward the door, their legs heavy with fear. The captain could feel the weight of the ship pressing down on him, its malevolent presence dragging him back. His thoughts raced, but there was no way out, no escape from the nightmare they had unleashed. They stumbled onto the deck, but the sky above them had changed. The stars were gone, replaced by a swirling vortex of darkness, a void that seemed to pull at them with an insatiable force. The ship was no longer afloat on water. It was drifting through an ocean of nothingness, a place where reality itself seemed to bend and twist. There was no horizon, no escape, only the black ship and the crushing darkness that followed it. The first mate was the first to collapse, his knees buckling as the ship lurched beneath him. "We're trapped," he gasped, his voice trembling with terror. "We never should have come." The captain turned to him, his heart heavy with guilt and fear. He could feel the ship's hunger, a deep, gnawing void that seemed to consume everything in its path. It had taken their souls, their lives, and now it would take everything else. There was nothing left to do but face the consequences of their actions. But then, as the crew gathered in despair, a strange noise filled the air, the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open. The captain spun around, his eyes wide with confusion. The door to the black ship's hold had opened, revealing a narrow staircase that led down into the depths of the ship. From within the darkness, a voice called to them, soft and distant, but unmistakable. "Come." It was a command, not a request. A summons, pulling them deeper into the heart of the black ship. The voice seemed to come from the very walls themselves, from the very ship that had ensnared them. And despite the terror that gripped them, the crew found themselves drawn to it. "No," the captain whispered, shaking his head in disbelief. "We can't go down there. It's a trap. We can't." But his words faltered as the voice called again, this time louder, more insistent. "Come." The crew hesitated, their instincts screaming at them to run, but they were no longer in control. Their bodies moved of their own accord, pulling them toward the staircase, their feet unable to resist the pull of the ship. The captain's breath hitched as he felt the ship's force surging around them, driving them forward. And then, as they stepped into the darkness below, the final, horrifying realization dawned on him. The black ship was not just alive. It was a prison, a cage for something far worse than they could ever have imagined. And now, they were the latest additions to its collection. With a deafening roar, the ship seemed to come alive, shaking with the weight of its ancient power. The shadows closed in around them, and the captain felt a deep, cold presence settling in his chest. There was no turning back now. As the crew descended into the heart of the black ship, the weight of the darkness pressed down upon them, pulling at their minds, their spirits, and their very souls. The stairs creaked under their feet, each step a reminder that there was no turning back. The ship, its walls lined with ancient symbols and strange carvings, seemed to pulse with a life of its own. It was as if the very air they breathed was soaked in the ship's centuries-old secrets, secrets that were now drawing them deeper into its depths. The captain was the first to reach the bottom, his hand instinctively reaching for the cold stone wall for support. The rest of the crew followed close behind, their faces pale, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and disbelief. What lay before them was more than a mere room or a hall. It was a vast chamber, stretching farther than the eye could see, illuminated only by the faint, eerie glow of an unknown source. At the center of the room stood a large stone altar, weathered and cracked by time. Its surface was covered in symbols that shifted and moved, as though they were alive. It was clear now that the altar was the heart of the black ship, the source of its power, the reason it had existed for so long. A soft, whispering voice echoed from the shadows, its tone low and soothing, but filled with an undeniable authority. "Welcome to the true heart of the ship. Here, you will learn the cost of your curiosity." The captain's throat tightened. The voice was familiar, but not in any way he could understand. He strained his ears, trying to place it, but all he could hear was the rushing sound of his own heartbeat in his ears. The first mate spoke up, his voice barely more than a whisper. "What is this place? What is it we're supposed to learn?" The voice didn't answer right away. Instead, the room seemed to grow colder, the shadows stretching longer, and the altar before them began to glow brighter. The stone surface cracked, revealing what lay beneath, a large crystalline object, pulsating with a dark energy that seemed to absorb the light around it. The crew stepped back instinctively, the chill in the air biting into their skin. "This," the voice finally said, "is the source of the Black Ship's power. It is a relic of a time long past, a time before your world even existed. And it has been feeding on the souls of the lost for eons. It is both a prison and a beacon, drawing those who dare to seek it into its depths." The captain's breath caught in his chest. "Feeding on souls?" He barely managed to speak the words. "But why? What's the purpose? What is this thing?" The shadows shifted, and from them emerged a figure, a being that was neither fully human nor entirely something else. It was a presence, ancient and twisted, with eyes that gleamed like blackened stars. It was the one who had spoken, the one who had led them here. "You came seeking answers, Captain," it said, its voice resonating through the ship like 1,000 whispers. "And now you will receive them. But know this, not all answers are meant to be understood." The figure extended a hand toward the crystalline object on the altar. The air grew thick, heavy with the weight of its power. "This ship was not always like this," it continued. "It was once a vessel of exploration, a ship that sailed the seas of your world. But it was drawn here, to the place between worlds, where the rules of reality are bent. And in that place, it found the thing that sustains it, this crystal." The captain stepped forward, his eyes locked on the crystal, now pulsing with an otherworldly light. "And this crystal, it's not just a power source. It's something else, isn't it?" The figure nodded. "Yes, it is a prison. And within it is the soul of something older than anything you can comprehend, something that existed long before your world was even a thought." The first mate, his voice shaking, spoke up. "And we've been feeding it. For how long?" The figure turned its eyes toward him, its gaze piercing and cold. "As long as you've existed. As long as this ship has sailed the seas. Every soul lost to the Black Ship becomes part of it. You, your crew, every soul that has ever wandered into this ship's path. You are all part of its collection, part of the power that keeps it alive." The captain's mind raced. He had heard stories of cursed ships, of ghostly vessels that sailed the seas, but this was beyond anything he could have imagined. This wasn't just a ship. This was something far darker, a living entity that thrived on death and despair. But then, as if responding to the captain's thoughts, the figure spoke again, its voice softer now, almost sorrowful. "You think you understand, but the truth is, you cannot. No one ever can." The crystal on the altar flared with an intense, blinding light. The room trembled, and the very air seemed to pulse with the power of the ship. The captain stumbled back, shielding his eyes from the searing glow. He could feel the ship's power rising around them, its hunger stretching toward them like a massive wave about to crash down. Suddenly, the light stopped. The air stilled, and in that silence, the captain heard the voice again. But this time, it was different. It was the voice of someone who had been waiting for this moment to come. "You have two choices, Captain," the figure said, its voice now a mere whisper. "You can join the others. Become part of the ship, Feed the crystal, and in doing so, gain power beyond anything you could imagine. Or you can destroy the crystal, shatter the heart of the black ship, and release all the souls trapped within it. But know this, in doing so, you will sacrifice your own soul to the void. The ship cannot be undone without a price, and you will not survive it. The captain stood there, frozen. The weight of the decision pressed down on him, suffocating him. He had always been a man of action, a man who faced danger head-on. But this was beyond anything he had ever faced. This was a choice that could not be undone, a choice that would shape not only his fate, but the fate of his crew and countless others. He turned to the first mate, his eyes searching for any hint of understanding. The first mate stood, his face pale, his body trembling. "Captain, we have to end this. We have to destroy it." But even as he spoke, the ship seemed to grow darker, the walls shifting around them as though the ship itself was closing in, ready to claim them. The captain took a deep breath, steeling himself for what had to come next. He stepped forward, his hand gripping the hilt of his sword. The figure in front of him watched silently, its eyes gleaming with an unsettling calm. "I will end this," the captain said, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped him. "I will free the souls of the lost. I will destroy this ship." With one swift motion, the captain raised his sword and drove it into the crystal, shattering the fragile surface with a force that sent shockwaves through the room. The ship groaned as though in agony, and the crystal cracked, splintering into 1,000 shards that scattered across the floor. The darkness around them seemed to recoil, as if the ship was being torn apart from the inside. The walls trembled, and the air filled with the sound of screaming souls, their voices rising in anguish and anger. The captain could feel the weight of their cries, the years of torment and suffering trapped within the ship. But as the crystal shattered, the figure in front of him smiled a cold, knowing smile. "You have made your choice," it said softly. "But remember, every choice has its consequences." The world around them began to collapse. The ship groaned, its very structure twisting and bending as the power that held it together unraveled. The crew scrambled, trying to escape, but the darkness was everywhere now, swallowing the light, the air, everything. And then, with a final earth-shattering roar, the black ship was no more. The captain awoke in a cold sweat, his heart racing in his chest. He sat up, his surroundings unfamiliar, the sense of dread still heavy in the air. But as his mind cleared, he realized something. He was not alone. A figure stood at the foot of his bed, its face hidden in shadow. And it spoke, its voice echoing in the darkness. "You thought you destroyed the black ship, Captain. But the black ship is not so easily destroyed.